Good morning and welcome back to biology. I just want to say that you all are very missed. The teachers are really wishing we had classrooms full of kids right now, but on the good side, on a positive note, you may wear a hat if you so choose. You may wrap up in a blanket and no one's going to correct that. And yeah, you can sit wherever you want. So here we go. I think this is where we left off. It's been a couple weeks, so hopefully I remember. We went through carrying capacity and kind of that concept that in ecology, all ecosystems actually have this upper limit of sort of how many species they can support, and we talked about some of the ways maybe that is determined is by how much food is available there. Oh, I need a different color. There we go. So how much food is available, if there's enough water, nesting sites or dens or whatever, and if there's specific breeding areas. Fish, I know sometimes there has to be, very specific environments for nesting, and even fish, of course, mostly produce eggs and then the male comes along later, so and fertilizes them. And so, yeah, those nesting areas are really important in our waters. So I think we mostly went over this, and we talked about how that the death rate has to equal the birth rate in order for populations to remain stable. If the birth rate is higher than the death rate, of course, we see that increase in population, and that's really what we've seen in the human population, actually very rapidly on this planet. So moving on, I want to go through food chains and food webs today. I know you probably have had this in 7th grade, so hopefully this is review. So we have to talk about those feeding levels a little bit. I don't remember if we maybe got kind of into, I think we maybe did talk about this page already, those trophic levels. We're going to go through that in a bit more detail. But so that we do say the sun is the ultimate source of energy in an ecosystem. We do know there's other sources of energy. If we go to deep ocean vents, for example, we have this whole chemosynthetic food chain that's not dependent on sunlight at all, but instead is dependent on that, the sulfur-rich minerals that are released at these deep ocean vents. And then there's a whole food chain. I think we looked at this in all sections of ecology, but in case we haven't, it's really interesting when we talk about the abyss of the ocean and that very deep, independent of sunlight. So this sulfur, there's bacteria that feed on it, and at these hydrothermal vents, and then there's little shrimp-like things and tube worms and so on that exist, all dependent on these organisms that can harvest the energy from that sulfur. Of course, most of the time when we talk about autotrophs, we think of plants, that can capture sunlight. We've talked about photosynthesis. Okay, so moving on. So autotrophs and then heterotrophs, everything that does not make its own food. So we also call these consumers. So consumers are heterotrophs. And then we can break this down into lots of different levels of consumers. So primary consumers, which we also call first level. So first level consumers, these are things that eat those plants or consumers. So examples of primary consumers are really anything that eats only plants. So examples would be in our area, rabbits, deer, and the list goes on and on.
you know, if we think domestically, cows, horses, those kinds of things. So anything that primarily feeds on plants. This includes obviously some insects, right? If you're a farmer, you worry a lot about damage from insects. Those are considered primary consumers. Secondary consumers, things that eat primary consumers. So we might say, you know, anything that eats deer, rabbits. When we think along those terms, it's a little hard to read. So wolves, coyote, fox, and so on might be considered secondary consumers. Birds that eat insects, right? Would also, if a bird eats an insect, it would be considered a secondary consumer. If a bird eats only fruit and seeds, then that bird is considered a primary consumer. So you see, like, there's lots of different kinds of birds, and you'll see when we start looking at food web that, yeah, each animal can even play more than one level in a particular food web. Okay, so other classifications. So and we could go into, let me go back here. There are also, you know, third level consumers, what we would call tertiary consumers, fourth level consumers as well. So further classification of organisms. So herbivores, so primary, those first level consumers, the things that eat only plants, are also classified as herbivores. Animals that are classified as carnivores eat only consumers. So again, herbivores we're talking about, right? Deer, rabbits, right? The same thing as primary consumers. So primary consumers are herbivores. That's just another name. Carnivores are things that eat only consumers. So again, the wolves, coyote. So carnivores eat only consumers. They eat only meat. So when we talk about carnivores, that's what we're talking about. Omnivores are things that can have a really varied diet. The things we think about, remember we talked about generalists and specialists in terms of their niches, and we said a generalist can have a pretty wide variety of things that they eat. So ones that we mentioned, if you remember, we said bear. Ooh, is that how we spell raccoon? Yes, it is. All right. And there's other omnivores too. There's some birds that can take advantage of eating both insects and seeds and fruits from plants. So those types of birds would be considered omnivores as well. Scavengers. Scavengers are things that can eat dead things. And everything that's a scavenger, like, might not always be a scavenger. So I think sometimes coyotes can be scavengers, right? Like they would feed on things that are already dead. But we certainly think of things like, you know, vultures, for example. Eagles feed on dead things a lot. We see that, like bald eagles do, but they also will go and catch live prey, and they don't necessarily depend on dead things. So they can be, again, in more than one place in those feeding levels. Decomposers are incredibly important in our world because they break down things that are dead, so those dead tissues and waste, back into the nutrients that are stored in them. So that carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and anything else that's tied up in those living tissues. Remember, on this planet, we only have a fixed amount of elements. Like, we have the same amount of carbon always. And all living things contain carbon, but when living things die, that carbon is returned to the earth. We're not getting more carbon from outer space, and we're not losing any carbon to outer space. And the same with nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and so on. We have that fixed amount. So these decomposers are just incredibly important in returning those elements back to the earth to be reabsorbed, retaken up by those autotrophs, those plants, and cycle through the food chain again. So I want to go through an example of a food chain just so you kind of understand how to label these primary, secondary consumers and so forth. So we know that every food chain begins with some sort of autotroph, okay? So let's start our food chain with some grass. And then I would say, so what things feed on the grass? Well, there's lots of things that do. We do have some insects, like, let's see, maybe a grasshopper. So my grasshopper is a consumer. It is a first level consumer. It is also a producer. So I'm going to say this is a producer. Sorry, my grass is a producer. Grasshopper is a first level consumer. Then what kinds of things eat the grasshopper? Well, I might have a bird, right? The bird is a second level consumer. I may also have something else. Let's see, what else might eat my grass? Maybe a rabbit? This would be a first level consumer. And actually, let's label this, yeah, we'll start with that. I'm also, you're going to do an activity on this, so pay attention to kind of how I'm doing this. I'm going to pause this and just kind of finish this just for time purposes. Okay, so I just finished this really quickly. So, you know, so the rabbit is eating grass, right? And then an eagle, let's say a giant eagle, swoops down, catches the rabbit. So that's a second level consumer. And then if the wolf eats the eagle, that's a third level consumer. However, the wolf would also eat the rabbit and probably anything else he could catch, right? So in that particular line, we say the wolf is also a second level consumer because the rabbit is a first level consumer. So that makes the wolf a second level consumer. This just kind of shows that, you know, each animal can be more than one level. They're not necessarily only that one single level. If the bird also ate, let's say, grass seed, it's a bird that eats insects, but also grass seed, then we would also put a line here. And that also makes the bird a first level consumer. So you have a worksheet to do on this. You have to do this exact thing on the worksheet provided. It's the Food Web worksheet that's linked to as a hyperdoc, or linked on the hyperdoc. The top part is exactly this, and the bottom part is create your own food web. And the very last part is to label O for omnivore, H for herbivore, C for carnivore.